Story 1. Nestled in the quiet suburbs of Tokyo, the Setagaya family lived a peaceful life surrounded by the promise of safety that their neighborhood was known for. But on the final night of the 20th century, their home became the site of a crime so brutal that it would haunt Japan for decades to come. As fireworks welcomed the new millennium, an unimaginable horror unfolded behind closed doors. By morning, an entire family lay lifeless, leaving behind a scene that baffled even the most seasoned investigators. What makes this case so chilling isn't just the gruesome nature of the crime, but the disturbing lack of answers. To this day, the question remains who could commit such an atrocity and, more importantly, why. The Miyazawa family consisted of 44-year-old Mikio Miyazawa, his wife, 41-year-old Yasuko Miyazawa, their 9-year-old daughter, Nina, and 6-year-old Rei. The four of them were murdered in what came to be known as Japan's most infamous quadruple homicide case. Since the Miyazawa family had dual incomes, Mikio worked for Interband, an international marketing brand based in London, while Yasuko worked as a teacher. Both of them were known to be kind individuals who were family-oriented and got along with everyone around them. Nina was in second grade while Rei had an intellectual disability and was undergoing speech therapy. The family lived in the Setagaya district, the second largest in Tokyo. They lived on Kamisoshigaya Street in a townhouse that was divided by a wall. On the other end of the wall lived Yasuko's mother, Haruko, and her father. At times, the other house was also occupied by Yasuko's sister and brother-in-law. However, because her brother-in-law worked for an international automobile firm, they spent most of their time abroad. Behind the house was a skate park called the Sashigaya Park, which Nina and Rei called the Choo-Choo Train Park. The skate park was separated by only a fence. It was during this time that the city was planning to expand the park, which is why many families had sold their houses and moved to different areas. The Miyazawa family were among the 2 out of the 4 families who had still not moved. This was because Yasuko often worried that the change would disrupt her children's routines, especially Rei, who was already struggling. However, despite this, they had already sold off the house and were going to move soon. Long before the murders took place, Yasuko began to notice strange things happening around them, but did not make much of them. In the summer of 2000, she found dead animals who had been brutally killed around the neighborhood. She also noticed a car parked in front of their house occasionally. She found it strange enough that she mentioned it to her father over Christmas dinner on December 25, 2000. A witness would later report that they saw a man in his early 40s roaming around the house on December 27th, only a few days before the murder. Once again, on December 29th, another man dressed in casual clothing in his late 30s or early 40s was seen walking around the Seiho Gakuenmai station, which was located only a few kilometers away from the Miyazawa house. Later that day, a man matching his description was also seen at a local supermarket purchasing a sashimi bocho knife. On the morning of December 30th, the same man was seen near Sengawa Station, only a kilometer away from the Miyazawa house. Additionally, a few days prior to the homicide, Yasuko had also confronted some kids at the skate park. Since their house was only separated by a fence from the park, it would often get too rowdy. Witnesses reported that the boys that she confronted belonged to a local motorcycle club, but this is yet to be confirmed. The murders December 30th started off as a normal day for the Miyazawa family as they prepared for the new year. Like most families around Japan, they prepared to celebrate Amasoka, a traditional celebration, on the last day of the year. This included making special dishes and was marked by the following certain traditions and customs. At 6 p.m. that evening, the entire family went to the local supermarket near Chitose Karasuyama Station, where they spent about half an hour before returning home. A witness corroborated this by confirming that the entire family was seen at the store. They returned home before 7 p.m. when Yasuko called her mother. Sometime later, Nina went over to her grandmother's house and watched television with her until 9 p.m. At 10 p.m. that night, a witness heard sounds of an argument from the Miyazawa house but did not think much of it since it sounded like a couple arguing. About half an hour later, at 10:38 p.m., Mikio accessed his password-protected email, which would become the last known activity. At around 11 p.m., Haruko heard a loud bang from her daughter's house, But this was not completely out of the ordinary for a household with 2 children. A witness also stated that they saw a man walking across the footpath near the house in a hurry during that time. Inside the house, an unimaginable horror began to unfold. It is alleged that the perpetrator entered through a small bathroom window on the 2nd floor, located adjacent to the park. He then made his way to Ray's room first, which was right next to the bathroom. 6-year-old Ray, who was fast asleep, would become the first victim as he was strangled to death. He was the only one in his family that did not sustain any stab wounds. Investigators speculated that Mikio, who was working on his computer, heard a disturbance coming from Ray's bedroom and got up to check. This was where he encountered the killer and tried his best to fight him off. After he managed to injure the killer, he was possibly pushed down the staircase, which would explain the loud thud that Haruko had heard. Mikio sustained multiple stab wounds to the neck, face, thighs, and arms. During his autopsy, fragments of the sashimi bocho knife were found in his skull. Yasuko and Nina were the last ones to be murdered. The 2 of them were asleep in an attic-like room on futons. As the killer crept into the room, he attacked both the mother and the daughter. After injuring them, he went back downstairs to grab a santoku knife from the kitchen. It is possible that Yasuko tried to stop Nina's bleeding with a tissue paper that was found next to the futons. After the killer left to grab another knife, she grabbed Nina and tried to escape but was caught and stabbed repeatedly. Out of all the victims, Nina and Yasuko were murdered brutally. It seemed that the killer continued to stab them even after they had died. Young Nina got the worst end of it as some of her teeth were found nearby, indicating that she had also been beaten before being killed. Her cause of death was a cervical spine injury. To make matters worse, it is alleged that the killer stayed in the Miyazawa household for up to 10 hours. After everyone was dead, he went into the kitchen and nonchalantly ate ice cream out of the freezer. He left the cups lying around the house with both his DNA and fingerprints all over them. He also consumed 4 bottles of barley tea and a melon. Once he was done eating, he used sanitary pads to clean the wound he had obtained while fighting Mikio before covering it up with a Band-Aid. The blood at the crime scene indicates that Mikio put up a good fight and managed to wound the killer's hand to the point where his bone might have been exposed. He would then go through the family's documents before dumping some of them in the bathtub. 2 of Yasuko's handbags, house keys, Mikio's wallet, and a hand towel covered with his blood were dumped in the bathtub as well. The perpetrator left his facies in the toilet and left without flushing. The last thing that the killer did was use Mikio's computer for about 10 minutes. He created a folder and clicked on one of Mikio's bookmarked websites, which was a theater website, and tried to book a ticket but left without doing so. Investigators also discovered that he had stolen about 150,000 yen from the house, roughly $950. The next morning, Haruko tried to call her daughter, unaware that their phone lines had been cut off. She decided to check up on Yasuko and went over to their house. When no one answered the door, she used her own set of keys to unlock the door and immediately knew that something was off. She walked into an eerily silent house and came across Mikio's body next to the staircase first. At the top of the stairs, she saw Yasuko and Nina's bodies before discovering Rei's lifeless body in his bed. At 10:56 a.m., she decided to call the police. Seiho police were the first to arrive at the scene but were later joined by Tokyo Metropolitan Police as well. Takashi Tsuchida, the chief of Seiho Police Station, was designated as the person in charge of the investigation at the time, until his retirement. It was deduced that the murders occurred from December 30th to December 31st at around 11:30 p.m. to 12:05 a.m. The investigators found themselves at the crime scene filled with so much evidence that it would take them several hours to process all of it. They collected DNA and fingerprints from all over the house. They also discovered an open first aid kit that was assumed to have been used by Yasuko to treat Nina's injuries due to the blood found on the bandages inside. Additionally, towels and sanitary pads covered with the killer's blood were also among the evidence collected. His fecal matter was also analyzed, revealing that he had a sesame spinach dish with string beans. Furthermore, both the murder weapons were found on the scene covered with the victim's blood. Forensic investigation revealed that the killer had type A blood. The amount of blood from the perpetrator found at the crime scene supported the theory that Mikio tried to fight back. Footprints around the house were also analyzed. They had come from a specific brand of shoes called Schlesinger and were approximately 27.5 centimeters, which is roughly US men's size 10.5. This size had never been manufactured in Japan and was traced back to having originated from South Korea. He had also left behind a gray Crusher bucket hat, a black Uniqlo AirTech jacket, a cheap plaid scarf, black gloves, a handkerchief, a fanny pack, and a white and purple shirt that was covered in the perp's blood. This particular shirt had only 10 units sold in Tokyo and 130 in the whole of Japan. The handkerchief has trace elements of a cologne called Drakkar Noir by Guy Laroche. The fanny pack had been sold in Japan from September 1995 to January 1999. Inside the bag was a grip tape that was often used on the surface of skateboards. As well as sand was also analyzed and found to have come from the southwest United States, specifically an area around an Air Force base that was roughly 100 kilometers north of LA. Short strands of dark brown or black hair were also found in the bed, which would later aid the police in establishing a profile. Not only had the killer spent several hours inside the family home, he also took a nap on the couch, although this has not been confirmed. Based on the items left behind by the killer, the police established a description. They deduced that the killer could have ranged from anywhere between 15 to 35 years of age due to the sheer strength required to scale the wall to reach the bathroom window, 170 centimeters tall, and had a thin build as the fanny pack's belt would only fit a size 32 waist. However, despite the staggering amount of evidence present at the scene, the police were unable to find anything conclusive. The fingerprints led to a dead end as they were not on any of the databases, indicating that the murderer did not have a previous criminal record. Investigators also managed to track down 7 of the people who owned similar clothing, but almost all of the clothing left behind was so common that it was near impossible to track everyone down. Investigators also discovered that the items had been bought from the area surrounding the Ajikubo station, which meant that he might have been from the west side of Tokyo. The DNA evidence also had no matches. The police chief, Takashi, revealed during an interview that the DNA investigation is all within an internal department. They cannot currently reveal any information at all. The only thing that they can publicly say is whether the DNA matches or doesn't match someone else, which meant that any information regarding the DNA of the killer had been leaked to the public. The results suggested that the killer was possibly mixed race, with maternal DNA indicating a mother of European descent, possibly from a South European country near the Adriatic Sea. Analysis of the Y chromosome revealed that the killer was part East Asian, either Japanese, Korean, or Chinese. Once the investigators made the killer's description public and asked for the public's help, they began to receive more information. A taxi driver revealed that he picked up 3 middle-aged men from an area near the Miyazawa house, claiming that one of the men was injured as he had left behind bloodstains on the seat. Another witness claimed that 6 hours after the homicide took place, a man came into the medical center at the Tobu Nikko station, located a few hours north of Setagaya district. His injury was severe, but the man, who was deduced to be in his late 30s, refused to give the medical staff any information about himself or an explanation for the injury. He was also seen to be wearing a black jacket and jeans. After his wound was treated, the man left. Since the case received widespread media attention, over 280,000 police officers assisted in the investigation. Operation Roller was conducted and over 5 million fingerprints were tested. These included fingerprints of criminals, neighbors, friends, and family. The DNA was tested 1.3 million times, but no matches were found. After experiencing no concrete results, the Japanese police reached out to South Korean authorities and asked them for their assistance. Although they declined to help, they did run the fingerprints through the database that was made for anyone who traveled to the country. But this proved to be yet another dead end. Some theories speculated that the killer entered through the front door and not the bathroom window, claiming that he escaped through the window once he heard Haruko arrive at the house in the morning. This would also explain why the mosquito net blocking the window had been thrown outside, instead of inside the bathroom. This theory suggested that the killer was someone that the family knew and had been led into the house by them. Some argued that if the killer entered through the front door, they would have to take their shoes off. It could have been possible that the killer put his shoes back on because the floor had become slippery due to the amount of blood spilled. However, footprints on the windowsill meant that it was likely that the killer entered through the window. Another theory suggests that the murder was premeditated and the killer belonged to the military, which would explain the sand found in the fanny pack. This would also explain the physical strength displayed not only to climb to the bathroom window but also to fight Mikio off and kill him. Since he possibly belonged to the military, it would not be odd for him to be protected by the government of his country. Another motive could have been money, but this seems unlikely as a large sum of money was still left behind. Yasuka and Nina's brutal murder also indicated that the killer hated women and held a grudge against the mother-daughter duo. This brings us to the next theory, which claimed that the skaters were involved as Yasuka had a confrontation with them right before the murder. Investigators also declared that the killer could have originated from South Korea, as well as the Miyazawa family was part of the Korean Unification Church. Since they were refusing to sell their land to them, it could have served as a possible motive. To this day, the case remains unsolved with no suspects in custody. Story 2. As chilling as that phone call sounds, trust me, you won't believe the wild twist that comes next. It is a horrifying crime that has a small South Georgia community on edge. Who's responsible for the deaths of 8 people in a Glenn County home? This is the devastating story of the Hines family. Around 8:15 in the morning on August 29, 2009, police received a frantic 911 call from a 22-year-old man named Guy Hines Jr. He claimed that his whole family had been murdered. When officers arrived at the trailer park, what they found was beyond horrific. 7 people already dead, and 2 others barely clinging to life. Sadly, one of the injured 19-year-old Michael Toller, who had Down syndrome, passed away the very next day. Police later revealed the victims had been beaten with some kind of heavy, blunt object, and they suspected 3 people were behind this shocking and brutal attack. The case rocked the community and quickly grabbed headlines worldwide, earning the grim title of the worst mass murder in Georgia's history. But the real question that haunts everyone is, who could be so cold-hearted to do something this horrific to a family of 9? Now, when tragedies like this strike, especially within families, the one person left standing often becomes the center of suspicion. It's a bitter reality, one that walks a fine line between the search for justice and the human need to make sense of the unthinkable. In this case, that spotlight fell squarely on Guy Hines Jr. despite sounding absolutely broken, panicked, breathless, and devastated on that haunting 911 call. Law enforcement couldn't immediately rule him out. In fact, to many investigators, something about his story didn't sit quite right. But before you jump to conclusions or clear his name entirely, don't close your tabs or lock your phone just yet. That phone call wasn't just a plea for help. It became the emotional backbone of this entire case. But to really understand what happened that day, we have to rewind the clock just a little, thanks to handwritten statements provided by his partner Jody. Along with a patchwork of surveillance footage and witness testimonies, we're able to stitch together a rare, intimate glimpse into Guy's final hours before the horror inside that trailer unfolded. Keep in mind, Guy didn't have a working cell phone at that time, so tracking precise times is difficult. And when you're recalling moments from a day soaked in trauma, memories blur, time warps, emotions twist the edges of every detail. But even with that, his story offers a chilling timeline that helps us piece together a narrative of what really might have happened. Now Guy's day started like many others, early and routine. Around 7 a.m., he woke up and got ready for work in the trailer park, where he lived with his large, blended family. The trailer was crowded, often filled with as many as 13 people on any given night. It wasn't fancy, but it was home. One of the key people in that trailer home was Russell Toller Sr., a 44-year-old father doing his best to keep his family safe and steady. He wasn't Guy Hines Jr.'s father, but he and Guy's dad, Hines Sr., were longtime friends. Even though they weren't related by blood, the two families shared the trailer to help each other out, both emotionally and financially. Russell Sr. was the kind of man others could count on. He had a tough, no-nonsense attitude, but deep down, he was fiercely protective of the people he loved. His son, Russell Toller Jr., was only 20 at the time. He didn't talk much and liked to stay in the background, but those who knew him said he was always respectful and stood by his family no matter what. Chrissy Toller, also 20, was Russell Sr.'s daughter and the mother of a young son. She lived in the trailer with her 3-year-old boy, Byron Jimerson, the only one who would survive the brutal attack. Chrissy's younger sister, Michelle Toller, was only 15. Bright, energetic, and full of promise, Michelle was still figuring out who she wanted to become. Then there was Michael Toller, Chrissy's other brother, who was 19 years old and lived with Down syndrome. Michael had endured multiple surgeries throughout his life, but never let that dim his spirit. According to neighbors, he was sometimes loud, but always full of life, energetic, smiling, and constantly moving. His presence brought a unique joy to the home, and everyone who met him remembered his laughter. Also living in the trailer was Brenda Flanagan, a 49-year-old close family friend. She wasn't a blood relative, but she was a constant presence in their lives, someone who helped out and had been around for years. Alongside her was Joseph West, age 30, another longtime friend of the family who often stayed over and shared meals, laughs, and the daily ups and downs of life with them. And finally, there was Guy Hines Sr., 45 years old, Guy Jr.'s father. Despite their complicated relationship, there was no denying the bond between father and son. Guy Sr. had a history of health problems and some legal trouble, but to his son, he was still family. He was still dad. Altogether, they formed a tight, if sometimes chaotic, household, tied together by blood, love, and shared struggles. Now, as for Guy Jr., every morning he met his boss, Rich, at the entrance of the trailer park where he lived, and Rich would give him a ride to their construction job. Guy was working on building a house somewhere in Georgia, and this was just another normal Friday for him. Later that morning, around 11:30 or noon, Guy and his colleagues met with a contractor, and after that, Rich dropped Guy and his friend Zach off at Zach's apartment. The plan was simple: chill, relax, and maybe go out to a bar later. Around lunchtime, Guy and Zach went out to eat, and then they went back to Zach's place to smoke some weed. To keep things clear, we'll just say substances here, since the video content could get flagged otherwise. After their little break, they headed to a golf clothing store to pick out some outfits for the night. Simple plans, but a typical day for these guys. Later that afternoon, Guy happened to bump into his brother Tyler near a McDonald's, and this moment turned out to be pretty important in the timeline. It's worth noting that Tyler didn't live in the same trailer as Guy. Still, the two brothers were very close. Tyler invited Guy to come hang out at the hotel, where he and a few friends were staying later that evening. Around that time, Guy called up Chrissy Toller and her boyfriend Joe, asking them to bring over some substances. Joe, who was known to be involved in selling, had some on hand and showed up about 30 minutes later. After that, they all went back to New Hope, the trailer park where Guy's family lived. According to Guy, everyone was still there when he arrived, and nothing seemed strange or unusual. He took a quick shower, shaved his head, and spent a bit of time at the trailer. Then he got a call from Russell Jr., who needed help fixing a battery cable on a car at a nearby motel. So Guy left around 9 in the evening to go help out. He ended up spending some time there, helping with the car, and hanging out with Russell Jr.'s girlfriend and her kids. On their way back, Guy stopped by a store where a woman working the sandwich shop confirmed she saw him at that time, which is a crucial piece of evidence. When they got back to the trailer, everyone was still there. Later, Guy borrowed Russell Jr.'s car to visit a girl named Summer, who had given him her number earlier. But when he got there, he got cold feet, feeling too out of it to see her. So instead, he went to a substance dealer's place and then headed to Barrington Park, a quiet spot he knew well where he could smoke in peace away from any police. He spent about 2 hours there under a tree, just chilling, though again he wasn't sure of the exact time since it was dark and he had no watch. After that, he tried to visit Tyler at the hotel again, but no one answered the door. One of the most important confirmations of Guy's story comes from surveillance footage at Parker's convenience store near the pier, where video showed him around 5:36 a.m. This evidence helped support the timeline Guy gave during his trial and added weight to his version of events. After that, Guy finally met up with Tyler and they spent some time together, before dropping off Tyler's girlfriend and friend, grabbing food at a place called the Huddle House, and then Guy decided it was time to head back to New Hope. It was early Saturday morning now, and around 8 a.m., Guy arrived at the trailer. The moment everything changed. What he found inside was beyond horrifying. The scene was gruesome and heartbreaking, and in a recording from prison, Guy described the shock and horror of what he saw when he walked in. He talked about Michael, who was still barely breathing on the bed, and how he ran outside screaming for help. A neighbor named Peggy was there, and she was the one who called 911. What's his last name is? He said his dad is dead, Rusty's dead, he said everybody's dead. I know there's a house full of people that live there. Okay, what's his name? He's freaking out. This guy. Guy? What's his last name? Guy, what's your last name? What's your last name? Honey? Her? Yeah. Here, talk to him. I just got home. My whole family's dead. Okay, tell me what's going on, sir. What? I just got home. I got home just now and everybody's dead. Who? I don't know. My dad's dead. How many people are there? There's like 6. My whole family's dead. Okay. It looks like they've been beaten up. I don't know, man. Okay. Tell me. I don't know what to do, man. Okay. You can see for yourself. Guy, I'm coming for you. Just stay on the line with me. Okay? Okay. I'll try to get up the map. They're coming for you. My family's dead. How many people are there? Your dad? Who else is there? My dad, my uncle, my cousins. Where's he at right now, ma'am? He's on the porch right now. He's on the porch? No fire and whatnot at that moment? I'm still right on the line. I haven't gotten off the phone with him. I'm going to stay. Is it okay if I stay on the line with you, ma'am, until they get there? Okay, here's our maintenance assistant. Hi, my name's Mike. I'm on the maintenance side here. Okay. What's going on, Mike? The guy that lives 2 doors south of me, his name's Guy Jr., I don't know his last name. He said his whole family's dead in here in the trailer. Okay, I'm standing right here in front of the trailer. I'm afraid to go in there. Yeah. No one should go in right now. Okay, I called the manager. She's supposed to be over here in a minute. Okay, yeah, we have everyone en route for you. We've got fire, EMS, and police coming to you. But I do want to stay on the line with you, buddy. All right, just wait. Yeah. Tell them to hurry. Do you think Michael's still alive? Someone's still alive? Is Mike still breathing? I can't go in there. Who's still alive? Which person? He's a young man. He's got Down syndrome. Okay. Now, given the detailed timeline and the surveillance footage that perfectly matched Guy Hines' own statements, you'd naturally think he'd be cleared of suspicion, right? That the evidence would prove he had nothing to do with this horrific crime. Well, guess what? Despite all that, Guy became the one and only suspect in a case that shocked everyone. This was especially surprising because initially, even the police themselves admitted that it was likely more than one person involved. At least 3 people had to have taken part in the attack. After all, how could a single man violently and silently beat 8 people in such a cramped trailer without anyone hearing or stopping him? Yet somehow, that's exactly what the authorities came to believe. And it all started because of that 911 call. To really understand how Guy was convicted, here's what happened. When he walked up to the trailer door that day, he noticed it was unlocked. Not unusual, since the family often left it that way. Right there, just inside the doorway, was his father, Guy Hines Sr., motionless and drenched in blood. His body was twisted still and horrifyingly disfigured. Guy froze. His stomach dropped. His mind couldn't process what his eyes were seeing. His dad's face. It didn't even look human anymore. Blood was splattered everywhere. The silence was chilling. And before he could even collect his thoughts, something inside him snapped. Panic, fear, disbelief. He started running through the trailer, calling out, checking rooms, hoping this was some sick nightmare. But it only got worse. Every room he entered was straight out of a horror film. The whole Toller family was scattered across beds and floors, each one beaten beyond recognition. Some were slumped awkwardly, some halfway off mattresses, others lying lifeless in pools of blood. One victim looked like he had tried to crawl away before collapsing. There was no movement, no signs of life. Just blood, silence, and shock. And Guy, he was spiraling. His hands shook. His legs felt weak. He didn't have his phone, and all he knew was that he had to find help. He searched desperately throughout the trailer, panic rising with every empty room he passed. Finally, he found one of Michelle's phones, but the battery was dead. His hands were shaking as he stumbled into another bedroom, still clinging to hope. What he saw there would haunt him forever. On the floor lay Russell Jr., lifeless. On the bed nearby was Michael, completely still, blood soaking into the sheets and splattered across the wall like a nightmare. A shotgun lay on the floor beside them, and in that moment, fear took over. What if the person who did this was still inside? Without thinking, he grabbed the shotgun, not to hide it or tamper with evidence, but to protect himself, to defend whatever was left. He was overwhelmed and unable to think straight, his body reacting on pure instinct. He ran out of the trailer, still clutching the gun, his thoughts swirling in a blur of shock and adrenaline. Reality felt twisted, like none of this could be happening. He threw the gun into the trunk, tossed the dead phone into the back seat, and sat in the car, shaking uncontrollably. At that point, Guy was already high, and the trauma only made his mind feel more foggy and disconnected. Maybe he thought he was too high, maybe this wasn't real. In that haze, he lit up another joint right there in Russell's car, hoping the smoke would dull the pain or bring some kind of calm. But no amount of marijuana could erase the blood, the silence, or the horror of what he'd seen. Then came the breakdown. He stepped outside again, screaming and crying, his voice cracking as he shouted, "My whole family is dead," over and over. His cries echoed through the trailer park, raw and desperate. One of the neighbors heard him and called 911 right away. If you listen to the recording, you can hear Guy's frantic, broken voice in the background repeating, "They're all dead. They're all dead." He ran back inside the trailer multiple times, desperate to help or find some kind of answer, until finally, he shouted to the operator, "Tell them to hurry, Michael's still alive." By the time the police arrived, Guy was outside, throwing up next to a truck. He was drenched in sweat, pale, shaky, and clearly in shock. Officers described him as wide-eyed and lost, trembling and confused. The retching and trembling didn't look like the behavior of a cold-blooded killer. It looked like the reaction of someone who had just walked through hell and seen the unthinkable. And yet, everything changed just hours later. Instead of being comforted or treated like a survivor, Guy was arrested just like that. 1 minute he was a grieving man, overwhelmed with shock. The next, he was the prime suspect in the most brutal crime the town had ever seen. No one else was seriously questioned or detained, only him. Then came the trial, which many now believe was full of holes, missing evidence, strange assumptions, and a theory that didn't make sense. The prosecution tried to spin a story that Guy, furious over missing painkillers, snapped and methodically beat 8 people to death with a blunt object in the dead of night. They claimed he did it quietly, leaving almost no evidence, and then showed up later acting like nothing had happened. But the story didn't add up. No one heard screams. No one heard a fight. There were no scratches or defensive wounds on Guy. No blood on him, no trail, no witnesses, no sign he'd cleaned up. And yet, despite all that, he was still convicted. District Attorney Jackie Johnson and her team celebrated it as a solid win. They believed they'd closed the chapter, locking up the man responsible for one of Georgia's most brutal family massacres. But cracks in that story started to form. Jody Sturt, who would later become Guy's wife, along with other justice advocates, began digging into the case. What they found wasn't just questionable, it was alarming. From the beginning, the case was circumstantial. Even the lead prosecutor, John Johnson, admitted that in court. "We don't have any evidence placing Guy Heinze Jr. at the crime scene during the murders," he told the jury. But they pushed ahead anyway, building the case on 3 basic things. Guy knew the victims, he used drugs, and he lived in the trailer. That was it. No eyewitnesses, no physical evidence, no confession, just assumptions. The Glynn County Police, led by Chief Matthew Doring, locked in on Guy almost immediately. He had found the bodies, he was the one who called for help. But instead of viewing him as a potential witness or even a victim, they treated him like the killer. One of the victims, Michael Toller, was still alive when Guy discovered the scene. Guy tried to help him, but Michael later died in the hospital. A toddler also survived, though with severe brain trauma. Neighbors who showed up after hearing Guy scream said he looked shocked, barefoot, and clean. They didn't see blood on him, he wasn't acting suspicious. He told them to call 911, and yet officers decided he was lying. They said blood on his shorts was incriminating, but Guy insisted it got there when he checked on the bodies. That explanation made sense, but they didn't want to hear it. The way the evidence was handled only made things worse. There was blood in a bathroom that might have belonged to an injured killer. Police photographed it, but never tested or preserved it. Other critical evidence wasn't tested either, or it was thrown out. Even the stuff that was collected, barely a fraction of it was ever analyzed. Then there's the issue with Officer Mike Owens. He took Guy's clothes but didn't log them into evidence that night. Instead, he kept them overnight, breaking the chain of custody. Internal Affairs had already flagged Owens for this kind of behavior in past cases, so how reliable could any of that evidence really be? Police also ignored leads, some of them serious. There were tips about possible gang-related suspects, people who had motives and violent backgrounds. These leads weren't followed up on until much later, right before the trial. By then, too much time had passed. Witnesses were gone, memories had faded, and the defense had little to work with. During the trial, the state's story stood on shaky ground. They brought in witnesses like Thomas Williams, who had been asleep in another part of the trailer during the time of the murders. He didn't see or hear anything, yet his testimony was still used to help shape the timeline. It didn't make sense. The whole case leaned heavily on assumptions and guesswork. So, how did this turn into a life sentence? How did a young man with no criminal history of violence and no blood on his hands end up behind bars for life? This wasn't just a courtroom failure. It was a failure at every level. From the rushed investigation to the ignored leads to the mishandling of evidence and the lack of real proof, everything pointed to a system more focused on closing the case than getting it right. Today, that conviction is being questioned more than ever. Advocates continue to fight for a re-examination of the evidence, and people who once believed Guy was guilty are starting to take a second look. Story 3. On July 3, 2019, Patrick Wells was found dead in a car crash. He was on his way to work, a normal morning that turned into something much darker. His car swerved off the road, crashing into a guardrail. It was quick, it was violent, and it was ruled an accident. But as investigators dug deeper, the pieces didn't add up. His wife, Maris, appeared to grieve. But was she hiding something? What if this wasn't an accident at all? What if this was something much darker? Maris Baptiste was born in the summer of 1984 in New Orleans, in a part of the city where hope came and went like thunderstorms. Her childhood was shaped by absence. Her father gone before she could remember his face, and a mother who was too busy keeping the lights on to notice how quickly her daughter learned to rely on herself. She was quiet, observant, and fast. On the track, she could outrun nearly anyone. It became the one place she felt ahead of the world. Coaches called her gifted. Some even said she had Olympic potential. But potential doesn't always pay rent. A minor injury sidelined her senior year. Scholarships slipped through her fingers. And not long after, at just 20, Maris became a mother. She named the baby Carol. No father's name was listed. No family showed up at the hospital. It was just the two of them. And for Maris, that was enough for a while. By her early 20s, she left Louisiana behind. Atlanta was calling. She arrived with one suitcase, a stroller, and no clear plan. What she had was determination. She picked up work as a receptionist in a midtown office building. She was polite, efficient, always put together. People liked her. But more than anything, they underestimated her. Maris listened more than she spoke. She remembered names, learned patterns. And slowly, she moved up, not through promotions but through connections. A dinner here, a favor there. She changed firms, neighborhoods, and the way she presented herself. By 30, she wasn't rich, but she lived well. Designer handbags, perfect nails, her daughter in private school. She made it all look effortless. But survival teaches you to want more than just comfort. Maris didn't just want security. She wanted control. Miles across the city, another life was running its course. Patrick Wells was a man built for structure. Born in 1978, raised in a quiet home in Atlanta, he was the son of a tax officer and a school librarian. His path was straight: honor student, accounting degree, a stable job, and eventually the title of chief financial officer at a fast-growing tech firm. He married Patience, a thoughtful, articulate woman who worked in community law. They had a son, Nathan. Their life was what most would call respectable. But respect didn't mean happiness. Over the years, the distance between them grew. Patience poured herself into cases. Patrick poured himself into work. At home, there was quiet, not the peaceful kind, the kind where two people sit in the same room and feel like strangers. Patrick began spending more time at the gym. It gave him structure, 1 hour where no one needed him to solve anything. No emails, no legal documents, just reps, music, and the hum of machines. And then one day she was there. It was late summer 2020. The gym in Buckhead buzzed with its usual after-work crowd. Patrick, like always, kept his headphones in and his eyes down. But that day, his routine broke. A woman was across the room in the stretching area, focused, unbothered, not looking for attention but somehow commanding it. Her name was Maris. They spoke briefly, a simple question about a machine, a thank you, a nod. But over the weeks, the exchanges grew. They started arriving around the same time. A wave became a smile. A smile turned into a conversation. He learned she had a teenage daughter. She said very little about the father. He shared that he had a son, a demanding job, and a wife he hardly saw anymore. The words came easier than he expected. Patrick began noticing things. The way she looked right at him when he spoke. How she never seemed to need anyone but was always surrounded by people who offered help. Maris didn't flirt. She didn't press. She just made it easy for him to imagine something else, something better. By the time fall rolled in, their presence at the gym had become a routine. One that felt intentional even if it was never spoken aloud. Patrick stayed later. He answered texts faster. And at home, the space between him and Patience became wider than ever. They started a secret affair. He once said to Maris, half laughing, "You ever feel like you're alive everywhere but your own house?" She didn't laugh. She looked him in the eye and said, "Then maybe you're building the wrong home." No promises were made. No plans were spoken. But at that moment, the foundation of his life began to shift. What started as a chance was about to change everything. Her words lingered in his mind, like a gentle push that he hadn't known he needed. It wasn't the first time someone had told him he deserved more. But with Maris, it felt different. It was as if she understood exactly how to get inside his head, without ever being too forceful. She never told him what to do. She simply made him realize what he had been avoiding for so long. That he could leave. That he could start over. Maris had an uncanny ability to lead Patrick down a path without him ever feeling coerced. She never suggested that he file for divorce. She didn't need to. Instead, she told him about freedom, about finding happiness, about rediscovering what it meant to live fully again. It wasn't about her. It was about him, or so it seemed. And as the months passed, it became easier for Patrick to justify it to himself. His thoughts, once filled with guilt and hesitation, were slowly replaced with a sense of possibility. His marriage to Patience had been built on a foundation that no longer stood. They had drifted for years. Patience was caught up in her work. He was stuck in a cycle of routine, and the emotional void between them was only growing. He'd tried to fix it, to communicate, to be there, but no matter what he did, it never seemed enough. And Maris, with her understanding and quiet encouragement, had made him feel like there was more to life than just existing. So on the 4th of March, 2021, after months of these quiet conversations with Maris, Patrick did it. He filed for divorce. The decision wasn't loud or dramatic. It wasn't a moment of rage or a desperate cry for help. It was a quiet choice, one made in the shadows of those conversations, in the safe space that Maris had unknowingly created for him. He left Patience. He left the life they had built. The marriage, once solid, now crumbled under the weight of years of neglect. The divorce was straightforward. There were no public blow-ups, no fiery arguments in front of the kids. Patrick didn't want that. He didn't want to cause any more pain. But underneath it all, there was a sense of relief, a sense of freedom that he hadn't expected. It wasn't that he didn't care about his son Nathan, but the guilt he felt for leaving wasn't enough to keep him in a marriage that had withered. When he told Patience, she wasn't angry, just resigned. She had already known. They had both known for years that things had changed. There was no dramatic confrontation, just the quiet exchange of words, the legal papers signed, and a life divided. Nathan cried during the weekends he had to spend with Patrick. He missed his mother, the only home he knew. Patrick would try to comfort him, but in those moments, the reality of what he had done, the life he had torn apart, hit him harder than anything Maris had ever said. On the 7th of June, 2021, Patrick and Maris married. The ceremony was small, just close friends and family. Maris appeared to be the perfect wife, the perfect mother. She organized the house, kept everything in its place, made sure Patrick's work life ran smoothly. But as the weeks passed, Patrick began to notice something unsettling. Maris was always watching him, watching Carol, watching the way everyone behaved. There was a certain quiet control in her actions, a sharpness in her gaze that didn't escape him, no matter how hard he tried to ignore it. She had convinced him, without ever pushing him, that he deserved more, that he could have more. As the months passed, the quiet tension in Patrick's life grew. On the surface, everything appeared to be fine. He had remarried Maris and they were building a life together. The house was kept meticulously and his work continued to demand his attention. But beneath the polished exterior, Patrick was changing, and not in ways anyone could easily pinpoint. Maris, ever calculating, had begun to spend more money, expensive clothes, new accessories, and the kind of lifestyle that would make anyone notice if they were paying attention. She would drop hints about wanting to redecorate, how things in the house didn't quite feel right, how a new car might make their life more comfortable. Patrick noticed it. He saw the receipts, the credit card bills, the constant deliveries to the front door. But he said little. His focus was elsewhere. At work, the pressure was mounting. His company was expanding and the demands on him had only increased. The late nights, the early mornings, every day felt like another challenge to keep it all together. His old life, the one he had with Patience, felt like a distant memory. Maris, with her sharp instincts, had made sure of that. And so he ignored the cracks in their new life. He ignored the growing tension between him and Carol, his increasingly erratic behavior, and the way his own reflection seemed more distant every time he looked in the mirror. It started with small things. Patrick would drink more, just a glass of whiskey after work to help him unwind, then another and another. It wasn't anything obvious at first, but slowly, the bottles seemed to empty faster. The tension of the office bled into his home life, and the weight of responsibility felt unbearable at times. He had always been the disciplined, controlled man, but now he was coming undone. He would stumble into the kitchen after work, sometimes still wearing his suit, his tie hanging loosely around his neck, and grab a glass. It became routine, just a little something to take the edge off. The change was subtle but undeniable. Maris noticed, of course, but she said nothing. Instead, she let him slip further into his own stress, all while playing the part of the perfect wife. She didn't need to tell him how to manage his life. She knew that he would continue to fall into old patterns of trying to fix everything on his own. She just let it happen. She let the cracks appear. It wasn't just the drinking. Patrick began to withdraw emotionally. The man who had been so attentive to detail, so driven, started to look past people. He became distant, almost cold, except when it came to Carol. His eyes lingered on her more and more, a quiet, unsettling shift that didn't go unnoticed. One evening, Patrick had gone to pour himself a drink in the kitchen, unknown to him. As he poured the drink, he spanked Carol, Maris' daughter, on her bum. Coincidentally, Maris was just coming down from the staircase and she saw it happen. Patrick just touched Carol, not in any way that a father should touch his daughter. His hand was on her shoulder, but his fingers were lingering in a way that made Maris' heart race. Carol, still in her pajamas, stood frozen in place, her expression empty. She didn't move. She didn't react. It was as though she had become a statue, lifeless, almost as if she had already resigned herself to what was happening. Maris stood motionless, her breath caught in her throat. It was as though the world around her had gone still. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, drowning out everything else. She did not confront him, but she started planning. She knew she had to act before things started to unravel too much, and in the quiet of their garden, she found the perfect tool to finish what she had begun. In the corner of the yard, amidst the flowers, was a patch of iris versicolor, a flower known for its striking purple-blue petals, but also for its dangerous properties. Maris had done her research. The iris versicolor was toxic, capable of causing nausea, drowsiness, and, if consumed in sufficient quantities, death. It was the perfect weapon, discreet, natural, and with just enough unpredictability to cover her tracks. She didn't rush. She knew that timing was everything. 24 hours later, Maris watched the irises bloom, their delicate petals unfurling under the warm summer sun, almost as if they were waiting for the moment she would decide to harvest them. With practiced hands, she carefully gathered the flowers. She washed them thoroughly, removing any traces of dirt. Then, one night, she ground the petals into a fine powder. The process was slow, meticulous, almost meditative. She mixed the powder with protein powder, the kind Patrick used every morning before his gym sessions. The smoothie was an innocent part of their routine. He would drink it before heading out to work, and it had always been a gesture of care, a simple act of making sure he started his day right. This time, though, it would be different. The next morning arrived quietly, like any other. Patrick was up early, as was his routine. He made his way into the kitchen, where Maris stood waiting. She greeted him with a smile and handed him the glass of smoothie. He accepted it without question, taking a sip as he began gathering his things for work. It was a hot summer day, and he had an early meeting to attend. He didn't notice anything different about the taste or the texture. To him, it was just another part of his daily ritual. Maris watched him closely as he drank, as he got ready to leave. She didn't blink. Her eyes never left him. Her thoughts focused on what was about to happen. Once Patrick finished the smoothie, he placed the glass down on the counter, ruffled Carol's hair as he walked by, and left for work. The door clicked shut behind him, and Maris stood motionless for a moment, taking in the silence of the house. Patrick had no idea what was coming. No idea that, within an hour, his life would come to an abrupt and violent end. As he drove to work, the effects of the iris versicolor began to take hold. First, it was a dull, creeping fatigue. His eyelids felt heavy. His vision blurred ever so slightly, but he tried to shake it off. The highway was quieter than usual at that time of morning. The sun was rising, casting a golden light over the road. Patrick's car hummed along, but the drowsiness set in deeper, heavier with each passing mile. At 8:37 a.m., just 30 minutes after leaving the house, Patrick's car veered off the road. It was a sudden, jarring movement, a sharp turn that sent the car into a guardrail. The impact was brutal. The crash was immediate. Patrick's body was found at the scene, his head slumped against the driver's seat, his body trapped by the wreckage. The authorities made their assessment. No foul play. It was just a tragic accident. A man behind the wheel too tired to focus, too distracted by the pressures of his life. But Maris, standing at the edge of her kitchen, watching the news report on the television, knew exactly what had happened. She had made sure of it. Every piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. The day of Patrick's funeral arrived with an unsettling calm. The church was filled with mourners, colleagues, old friends, distant family. They came to honor the man they remembered, the responsible, disciplined corporate executive who had left behind a legacy of hard work and professionalism. They didn't know the full story, didn't know the truth about his last hours. They didn't know the details of his tragic death. His final moments blurred by the effects of a smooth, seemingly innocent drink that had been prepared for him with such precision. Maris was the epitome of grief that day. Her black dress clung to her body as she stood in front of the open casket, tears streaming down her face, her hand resting gently on the edge. Nathan, Patrick's 5-year-old son, was clinging to her side, his face full of confusion and fear. He didn't understand why his father was no longer there. Carol, now 15, stood beside her mother, her face drawn tight, her eyes empty. It was clear that Carol wasn't crying. In front of the congregation, Maris stepped up to the podium, her voice trembling with emotion, every word carefully crafted for maximum impact. She cleared her throat, wiping away an imaginary tear, and then she spoke. "He was a hero," she said, her voice quivering but firm. "A father, and my everything. Patrick was the best man I ever knew. He loved us all, and he worked so hard to provide for this family. He was truly a man of integrity, a man of honor." The crowd nodded, some wiping their own eyes, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The words were perfect, of course. They were exactly what they expected to hear from a grieving widow. There was no hint of the manipulation, the cold calculation behind those tears. There was only the sorrowful image she had so carefully painted. For Maris, this was the final act, the last step in convincing everyone that her husband's death was just an unfortunate accident. Nothing more, nothing less. 3 weeks later, Maris was sitting in a bank office, across from a stiff-looking financial advisor. She was calm, composed, her hands folded neatly in front of her as she discussed the final steps of her late husband's estate. Patrick's will had been straightforward. Everything was left to her. Everything. She signed the papers with a flick of her pen, and within moments, $800,000 was transferred into her account. The advisor looked at her briefly, his eyes flicking from the paperwork to her face, but Maris didn't notice. She was already thinking ahead. She had done everything she needed to do, and now it was time to move on with her life, free from the shackles of her past. It was just another transaction, another part of her meticulous plan falling into place. Maris had planned this moment from the very beginning. Patrick's death, his inheritance, the money that would secure her future and Carol's. She didn't have to ask for permission. She didn't have to explain herself. Everything was hers, every penny. And once the paperwork was completed, she moved quickly. She wasted no time. Within days, she booked a luxury vacation for herself and the children, Carol, still silent and distant, and Nathan, who seemed to have no understanding of what had happened to his father, only that his life had changed forever. The destination was Barbados, the tropical island, known for its clear blue waters and golden beaches, would be the perfect escape from the grief that she had played so perfectly. The perfect place to unwind, to enjoy the fruits of her labor. Patrick's death had given her everything she wanted. Now it was time to enjoy the rewards. She packed their bags carefully, selecting only the finest clothes for herself, new outfits for Carol, and even a few toys for Nathan. She made sure everything was arranged. The house was quiet now, too quiet, but Maris had no intentions of returning there for a while. She needed time to settle, to let everything sink in. On the day of the flight, Maris held the passports and tickets tightly in her hands as they stood in the airport, waiting to board their flight to paradise. Nathan skipped ahead, his small feet light on the polished airport floor, eager for the adventure. Carol, as always, stayed a step behind, her face blank, her expression unreadable. Maris, for the first time in weeks, allowed herself to feel a sense of freedom, an overwhelming sense of release. No one was left to question her. No one was left to suspect the truth. Patrick's death had been ruled an accident, and the money was now hers to spend. She had outsmarted everyone. She had secured her future, and with it, Carol's as well. As the plane soared into the sky, Maris glanced over at Carol, who was staring out the window, lost in her own thoughts. For a moment, their eyes met, but neither spoke. The silence between them felt heavier than ever, but Maris had long ago learned the power of silence. It was the perfect cover for everything she had done. The plane touched down in Barbados, and Maris was ready to start fresh, to leave behind the life she had constructed so carefully. The resort was everything she had imagined, luxurious, private, and far from the life she had known in Atlanta. She checked into a villa with panoramic views of the ocean, a place where she could blend in with the rich and famous, where no one would ask questions about the man who had died just weeks earlier. They spent the first few days by the pool, lounging in the sun, sipping cocktails, and enjoying the illusion of a perfect life. Nathan played in the sand, laughing and splashing in the water, while Carol wandered the beach, always at a distance, always apart. It was the kind of vacation Maris had always dreamed of. No responsibilities, no reminders of the past, just the sun, the ocean, and the feeling that she had won. For Maris, this was only the beginning, the perfect widow with the perfect life, ready to start over. But in the quiet moments, in the spaces between her carefully curated smiles, there was always a nagging thought in the back of her mind. How long would it take before the truth was uncovered? How long before someone noticed that Patrick Wells hadn't simply died? He had been erased. Patience Wells, Patrick's ex-wife, had watched the funeral from a distance. She hadn't been as close to Patrick in the years since their divorce, but she knew him better than anyone. She knew his rhythms, his habits, and his way of doing things. The funeral had felt off. Something about the whole thing didn't sit right with her. The mourners had been polite, of course, but there was an odd distance between them, a disconnection that made the event feel like a formality, rather than an outpouring of grief. More troubling than the strange atmosphere at the funeral was the fact that Maris had refused to let her see the body. That wasn't typical. Even in the most painful of circumstances, Patience had always been allowed to say her goodbyes. But Maris had insisted. "It's for the best," she had said with a tear-streaked face. "The body's already been prepared. It's too difficult right now." Patience didn't believe that. The refusal didn't feel like grief. It felt like something else. Something that didn't add up. But it wasn't just that. In the days after Patrick's death, Patience learned something else. Something that left her feeling more unsettled than ever. Maris had claimed nearly everything from Patrick's estate. She had taken full control of his savings, his insurance policies, and his inheritance, all of it without hesitation. It wasn't just the money, it was the speed with which it happened. The paperwork had been filed almost immediately, and no one had questioned it. She had made it all seem seamless, as if there was no room for doubt. No reason to ask questions. Patience had felt something tug at the back of her mind. A knot that wouldn't loosen. There was something wrong. Something wasn't right. She couldn't put her finger on it, but she knew Patrick too well to believe that his death, his sudden and untimely end, was just a tragic accident. The man she had been married to for 10 years had never been reckless. He had never been careless. Patrick's death couldn't have been as simple as it seemed. And that's when Patience decided she couldn't just sit back and accept it. One evening, she called a number she had come across in an old case file. The name on the card read L. Roy Mayfield, a former homicide detective who had made a name for himself solving cold cases. His reputation was solid, and he had a knack for spotting what others missed. After a brief exchange, they agreed to meet. Patience met L. Roy in a small, quiet cafe on the outskirts of Atlanta. The place was quiet, with low lighting and the smell of coffee filling the air. When L. Roy arrived, he was just as she had imagined. Tall, confident, with a calm, no-nonsense demeanor. His sharp eyes immediately took in the surroundings, the body language of those sitting nearby, and even the faint sound of a conversation that wasn't really hers to hear. He was a man who noticed everything. "I've got a feeling," Patience began, her voice tight with frustration, "that something about my ex-husband's death doesn't add up. I know I don't have any hard evidence yet, but I need someone to look into it." L. Roy listened carefully, his arms crossed as he leaned back in his chair. "What exactly are you suspecting?" "Everything," Patience said flatly. "The funeral was odd. I wasn't allowed to see his body and Maris. She moved too quickly. She claimed everything, his savings, his investments. I don't trust her, and I don't trust that it was just an accident." L. Roy took a slow breath, then nodded. We'll start with the basics. A thorough look at the accident reports. We'll dig into the financials. But before we go too deep, I need you to answer one question. What do you really think happened? Patience paused, her fingers nervously tapping on the table. I think my ex-husband's death wasn't an accident, and I think Maris knows more than she's letting on. He started with a simple task. Surveillance. He needed to see what Maris did in the days and weeks following Patrick's death. At first, it was just a matter of sitting outside the house, observing her movements. He knew she had to be careful. After all, she was the widow, the grieving woman who had already begun to play her role in public. But Maris was methodical. Every action she took seemed calculated, every move deliberate. For days, Roy watched her routine unfold. In the mornings, she would rise early. At first, there was nothing unusual about her actions. Breakfast, a quick check of her phone, preparing for the day ahead. But one morning, Roy noticed something that caught his attention. Maris went into the backyard, as she did every day, and watered a particular plant. It was a single iris versicolor, standing at the far edge of the garden, tucked away behind a row of other, less notable flowers. First, Roy didn't think much of it. A woman tending to her garden. It seemed innocent enough. But then he saw it again the next day, and the day after that. Every morning, without fail, Maris watered the same plant. She spent more time with that flower than any other. It was almost ritualistic, the way she bent down, her fingers brushing the petals as she poured the water around its base. Roy's instincts kicked in. He had been around long enough to recognize when something didn't feel right. He pulled out his notes, cross-referencing everything he knew about iris versicolor. He was no botanist, but he remembered the mention of the plant from his earlier research. The name was familiar, and as he dug into his files, it all started to click. He found forensic reports on iris versicolor and its toxic properties. The plant was known to contain compounds that could cause nausea, dizziness, and confusion when consumed in large quantities. The symptoms matched those Patrick had experienced. That gnawing feeling in Roy's gut grew stronger. He wasn't just dealing with a tragic accident. This was looking more like a carefully orchestrated plan. A plan that began with that specific plant. He revisited the crash report. The official report claimed Patrick lost control of his car at 8:37 a.m., just 42 minutes after he left the house. But there was something wrong with the timing. Patrick had left his home early that morning. He had consumed the smoothie made by Maris, which had included the iris versicolor. The toxic effects of the plant would have begun to take hold gradually, but the crash, Patrick's inability to control his car, happened far too quickly after he left the house for it to be a natural accident. The symptoms of iris toxicity didn't take effect instantaneously. There was a delay, a slow descent into confusion and fatigue, a gradual loss of motor skills. But Patrick's crash had happened so suddenly. It didn't fit the pattern of a natural accident at all. There was no sign of braking, no evidence that he tried to steer the car to safety. The crash was violent and immediate. Roy spent days reworking the timeline, cross-referencing the details of the accident with the known effects of the toxin. And then, a small detail in the crash report caught his eye. The emergency responders had noted that Patrick's body showed signs of drowsiness, but they hadn't given it much weight at the time. A common symptom of iris toxicity, drowsiness, confusion, impaired reflexes, had gone unmentioned in the initial report. Patrick had been physically fine until he got behind the wheel. And then everything changed. As Elroy's investigation progressed, the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place with terrifying clarity. The evidence was mounting, but there was one crucial thing missing. The body. Patrick Wells had died. But where was his body now? The grave had been sealed, the funeral had been completed, and the official cause of death was still an accident. Yet everything Elroy had uncovered suggested otherwise. He called patience, his voice steady but with an edge of urgency. I think we need to go further. I think the body's the key here. Without it, this investigation can't go anywhere. Patience, already growing more suspicious by the day, agreed immediately. She had already felt the presence of something wrong, a nagging feeling in her gut that told her there was more to Patrick's death than what was presented. She had lost her ex-husband, and now she was losing her sense of justice. Until Elroy's call. With the mounting evidence that pointed to foul play, Elroy and Patience took their findings to Judge Marcellus King, a man known for his no-nonsense approach to justice. The request for an autopsy and an exhumation was unprecedented. But given the circumstances and the undeniable discrepancies between Patrick's supposed accident and the actual cause of death, the judge granted their request. The motion was filed. The wheels of justice were now turning, slowly but inevitably. It was the 17th of August, 2021, when the decision came through. The grave of Patrick Wells would be dug up. The morning air was thick with tension as the workers arrived at the cemetery. The soft scrape of shovels against earth broke the silence as they began to dig. Elroy stood off to the side, arms crossed, watching intently. Patience was beside him, her eyes fixed on the hole as it grew deeper. There was something both eerie and necessary about this moment. Something that felt like the very truth was being unearthed. The workers finally reached the coffin. The heavy lid was pried open, and the earth trembled with the weight of what they were about to discover. But when the lid of the coffin was lifted, a strange, unsettling silence fell. The coffin was empty. There was no body. The air seemed to drain out of the space. Elroy and Patience exchanged a look of shock. It was impossible. It didn't make sense. The police had closed the case. The burial had been completed. Everything had been normal, except now it wasn't. It wasn't just calculated. Elroy muttered under his breath, his eyes scanning the empty coffin. It was erased. He ran his hand through his hair in disbelief. The body was gone, but the truth was slowly coming to light. This wasn't just a case of negligence or oversight. Someone had exhumed the body. Someone had covered their tracks so perfectly that it now felt like they were dealing with a ghost. A man whose death had been erased from the earth itself. And the more Elroy thought about it, the more it became clear who was behind it all. Maris. Elroy wasn't about to let it go. He wasn't going to let her get away with it. His pursuit of Maris led him to an unlikely place, an amusement park. The bright lights and the laughter of children felt like a stark contrast to the dark truth Elroy was chasing. But there she was, standing in front of the Ferris wheel, surrounded by Nathan and Carol. They were watching the fireworks in the distance, their faces illuminated by the bursts of color lighting up the night sky. It was almost surreal. Maris, the perfect widow, the mother who had carefully crafted the illusion of grief, now appearing so relaxed, so untouchable. Her eyes followed the fireworks, her smile almost serene as she held her children close. But Elroy wasn't fooled. His mind was sharp, his patience gone. This was the moment. The truth had to be revealed. He walked towards her, his steps quick and purposeful. She noticed him immediately, her posture straightening, her smile flickering for just a moment before she turned her face toward him. There was no fear in her eyes, no sign of panic, just a quiet, unsettling calm. He didn't wait for pleasantries. His voice was firm, confrontational. "Where's the body, Maris?" he demanded, his eyes locked onto hers. Her smile remained calm, almost knowing, as if she had been expecting this moment all along. She didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned in slightly, her voice smooth, almost playful. "I've always loved fireworks," she said, her smile widening, as though she were offering a riddle that only she understood. Only something bright and dazzling can truly erase the past. The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, Elroy stood there, staring at her. It took him a moment to fully understand. The pieces clicked into place, each word, each gesture she had made, suddenly making perfect sense. The fireworks, the brilliance of something bright enough to overshadow everything else. And then it hit him. She hadn't just hidden the body. She had made sure it was gone forever. She had Patrick cremated when she observed him monitoring her. The cremation, the missing body, the way she had manipulated everyone around her. It all came down to this. Maris wasn't just a grieving widow. She was a woman who had taken control of every aspect of Patrick's life, and then his death with chilling precision. Maris tilted her head, her smile never wavering. Her eyes sparkled with an almost eerie confidence. "Elroy," she said softly, "you're so focused on what's gone that you haven't considered the real question. Do you really think it matters now?" She paused, letting the question linger between them, the sound of fireworks echoing in the background. The past is gone, just like him. There's nothing left to find. The realization hit Elroy like a cold wave. He had never encountered anyone quite like her. Someone so utterly confident, so frighteningly capable. This woman was dangerous, far more dangerous than he had initially realized. But as he stood there, staring at her, Elroy knew he couldn't let her go. Not this time. Not after everything she had done. Elroy didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, reaching for his phone, his hand steady. He called for backup, his voice clipped, his instructions clear. Within minutes, officers arrived at the scene. Maris' expression didn't change. She didn't fight it. She didn't even look surprised. She simply allowed them to cuff her, her face still smiling, still composed. The officers escorted her away from the park, the fireworks now fading into the distance, the night air suddenly feeling colder, more oppressive. Elroy stood there for a moment, watching her disappear into the back of a squad car. His mind raced. He had finally caught her, but there was no satisfaction in it, no relief. Because even though Maris was now in custody, the true scope of her crime was something that would linger long after her arrest. September 20th, 2021. After her arrest, Maris was charged with first-degree murder, fraud, and tampering with evidence. The prosecution's case was built around the overwhelming evidence that pointed to her involvement in Patrick Wells' death. Detective Elroy Mayfield's investigation had exposed the deliberate nature of her actions, from the iris versicolor she had planted and used to poison Patrick, to the cremation of his body, before the investigation could even begin. In a moment of quiet, when the defense rested its case, Maris stood up, her eyes fixed on the judge, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Without any prompting, she began to speak. Her voice was calm, eerily so, but the words she spoke sent a chill through everyone present. "I did it," she said, her gaze never leaving the judge. "I poisoned him. I wanted to punish him for what he did to Carol. I wanted everything. I planned it all. His death, the money, the inheritance. He had no idea what I was doing. He never suspected that I was slowly, methodically destroying his life. But I had to erase him. I had to erase everything that came before me." The room fell silent as Maris confessed her crimes in a voice full of unsettling calm. She spoke about how she had used the iris versicolor to poison Patrick, how she had made sure his body was cremated before anyone could trace the cause of death. She spoke of her desire for power, for control, and for the life she felt she deserved. She didn't express any regret, only a sense of inevitability, as though she believed she had done what was necessary. In the end, Judge Marcellus King delivered the verdict. "Maris Baptiste Wells, for the cold and calculated murder of your husband, and for the fraud and tampering with evidence that followed, you are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." As the gavel came down, Maris's expression remained unchanged. She had confessed she had been caught, but she showed no remorse, no signs of fear. She simply turned and walked out of the courtroom, escorted by officers, her future sealed. For everyone in the courtroom, it was clear that justice had been served. Maris had thought she could escape, that she could erase her past and live a new life with all she had stolen. But in the end, the truth had come for her, and now she would spend the rest of her life in prison, unable to erase the consequences of her actions. Story 4. October 12, 2017, 3:17 a.m. A mother, her newborn and the family dog were found dead inside their perfect home. No witnesses. The grieving husband, a beloved pastor, was hailed as a victim. For 6 years, no one questioned a thing, until a second woman came forward and one forgotten diary cracked the entire case wide open. Peter Daniels was the kind of man who made people stop and pay attention when he walked into a room. He was polished, charming, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had worked hard to build an entire image. In Silver Creek, Georgia, he wasn't just a pastor, he was a symbol of success. He delivered sermons that left his congregation wiping tears from their eyes one moment and clapping their hands the next. People admired Peter because he seemed to have it all: the growing church, the successful small business, the picture-perfect family, and the kind of reputation most men only dreamed about. By his side was Angela Daniels, a soft-spoken plus-size woman whose kindness was the kind that made people remember her. She came from a respected family in the community, known for their charity work and social ties, and her marriage to Peter had been celebrated as a union that strengthened both their standings in the town. They had been together for years, and after many prayers and hopeful moments, they had finally welcomed a baby girl, just 3 months before everything fell apart. To those who saw them in passing, the Daniels family looked like a blessing. Their home was a large, beautiful house on the corner of a quiet street, with a wraparound porch, a manicured lawn, and a pet dog that always seemed to be playing in the yard. Peter would bring his wife and baby to Sunday service, smiling proudly, shaking hands with parishioners, holding Angela's hand tightly, making sure everyone saw them together. They were the golden family that people wanted to emulate. But on October 12, 2017, at exactly 3:17 a.m., that golden image shattered. A neighbor, shaken and pale, called the police, whispering into the phone that something sounded wrong next door. They had heard muffled noises, strange thumps against the walls, the kind of sounds you don't want to imagine in the middle of the night. Officers arrived quickly, lights cutting through the early morning darkness, trying to keep the neighborhood calm. But what they found inside the Daniels home was anything but calm. Angela was lifeless. Her baby girl was also lifeless. The family dog was dead. Outside neighbors gathered in small groups, arms crossed, eyes wide, whispering about what could possibly have happened. The news spread like wildfire throughout the town. By morning, everyone knew something had gone terribly wrong inside the Daniels home. No one suspected Peter. How could they? He was the grieving husband, the heartbroken father, the beloved pastor. People brought food to his doorstep. They hugged him tightly at church. They wept with him, sat beside him, held his hands, praying for him, for Angela, for the baby. The public shock was overwhelming. The community reeled from the disbelief that something so violent, so tragic, could happen to people they admired so deeply. To those who had once sat beside Angela in church, or watched Peter hold his baby proudly after a sermon, it was impossible to imagine that the man standing among them could experience this great loss. The town of Silver Creek now became a place filled with questions no one dared speak out loud yet. At least not yet. Peter Daniels remained untouchable in the eyes of his neighbors and friends. After all, he was the man they respected, trusted, and the man they were sure had just suffered the worst night of his life. But behind the scenes, as the investigation quietly began, small cracks were already beginning to show. And over the next 6 years, those cracks would widen into gaping holes that no one could ignore. Because in Silver Creek, the truth was waiting just beneath the surface, and it was only a matter of time before the mask began to slip. In the months following the brutal murders inside the Daniels home, investigators found themselves pulled in every direction, trying to separate truth from noise. They desperately hoped that one clear lead would break the case open. At first, they explored the most obvious theories. Was this a random attack, a violent intruder slipping quietly into a peaceful home in the middle of the night? Could it have been someone targeting Angela directly, perhaps a hidden grudge or a dark secret no one had seen? Or was it Peter's own business life drawing dangerous attention, an angry client, or a financial enemy finally taking revenge? The community offered plenty of speculation, and detectives followed every thread they could find, but each theory led them into new questions without answers. The break-in looked staged, yet there was no forced entry, no stolen valuables, no clear motive from outside the home. What emerged instead were buried in digital trails and small details. Angela's late-night searches revealed a woman quietly looking for a way out. Custody arrangements, legal separation, apartment rentals. These were not the searches of someone feeling secure and happy. They were the quiet moves of someone planning an exit, someone building the courage to leave, someone afraid to speak those fears aloud. Detectives began re-examining the Daniels marriage, and what they found beneath the polished surface made them uneasy. Angela had withdrawn from friends, reduced family visits, and quietly stepped back from church events. Peter, in contrast, had pushed forward, more involved, more visible, his sermons filled with messages of strength and unity. The public face of the marriage was polished and intact, but the private space was cracking. And yet, despite these observations, the findings were not enough. The investigation got stalled, leads ran dry, suspects were ruled out, and the case quietly slipped into the cold case files. Months turned into years. Peter remained in the community, still admired, still leading, still appearing as the man who had survived an unthinkable loss. It wasn't until nearly 5 years after Angela's death that Peter began quietly seeing someone again. Naomi Johnson, a fellow believer from the church, someone who had admired Peter from afar. Naomi knew Peter's story, knew his tragedy, and like many in the congregation, she believed he was a man of faith who had endured more than most. Their courtship stretched over time, marked by polite conversations and careful invitations. It seemed at first like Peter was healing, rebuilding, allowing himself to hope again. But behind closed doors, the patterns Naomi began to notice troubled her. Small criticisms turned into cutting remarks. His public warmth turned cold at home. His moods shifted without warning, his anger unpredictable. Naomi at first tried to excuse it, telling herself he was still grieving, still carrying heavy burdens. But over time, her unease grew. She noticed how tightly Peter controlled decisions, how quickly his frustration ignited, how her own voice began to feel small inside the home. Then came the night that shattered her trust. Naomi was ironing Peter's shirt for a business meeting, and by accident, the fabric got burnt. What followed was not a simple outburst, but a full-blown threat, Peter's voice low, his face tight, warning her that if she ever ruined something for him again, she'd regret it and he'll kill her. For Naomi, it was the moment everything changed. She had heard enough, seen enough, felt enough unease to understand that she needed help. Quietly, without telling Peter, Naomi approached the police. Her report was cautious, careful, filled with hesitation, but it sent ripples through the cold case files. A second wife, coming forward with concerns about threats, control, and hidden anger. It was the push investigators needed to revisit every detail they had set aside years before. Naomi's courage sparked something vital. It wasn't proof by itself, but it was the match that lit the dry kindling of suspicion already waiting. The story of Peter Daniels, the grieving husband, the heartbroken father, the respected pastor, no longer looked quite the same. And as detectives began weaving Naomi's report into the old case files, the shape of the investigation shifted. The theories of random attack, jealous rivals, and shadowy intruders began to fade, replaced by something much closer to home. Something that had been waiting quietly, hidden in plain sight, all along. 6 years after the murders that had haunted Silver Creek, Georgia, a discovery was made that would change everything. Tucked away in a sealed box, buried among personal belongings no one had dared or thought to examine, Angela Daniels' hidden diary came to light. It was an accidental moment, yet it held the weight of 6 years of unanswered questions and unspoken fears. Investigators, who had combed through financial records, community rumors, and cold leads, now held in their hands something that spoke with Angela's own voice. Page after page detailed a life of quiet suffering. It painted a picture far different from the polished image the Daniels family had shown the world. Angela wrote about Peter's words cut her down when no one was watching. She described his body shaming, the way he chipped away at her confidence, leaving her feeling small, insignificant, controlled. She detailed his outbursts, the unpredictable swings between charm and cold dismissal, the control over household decisions, the isolation that crept into every corner of her life. And then, there was the final entry. Dated October 11, 2017, Just one day before her death, Angela's last written words were filled with fear and determination. She was making plans to leave. She was afraid for her safety, afraid for her baby's safety. She had reached a breaking point, ready to escape a marriage that was crumbling behind closed doors. She did not know what the next day would bring, but her words made one thing heartbreakingly clear. She wanted out, and she wanted to protect her child. The discovery of the diary did not stand alone. Naomi's earlier report about Peter's threatening behavior had already raised red flags. Investigators now connected the dots between the past and the present, between Angela's desperate writings and Naomi's whispered fears. And when they overlaid these personal accounts onto the cold, hard financial data they had uncovered, the mounting debts, the hidden loans, the failing business ventures, the picture sharpened into painful focus. Local detectives realized they were dealing with something bigger than a simple cold case. Peter's financial deceptions, his business entanglements, and the movement of funds across state lines raised red flags that stretched beyond local jurisdiction. With this, the FBI was brought in, their expertise called upon to help unravel the layers of fraud, manipulation, and cover-up that had allowed Peter Daniels to evade suspicion for so long. What had once seemed like a random act of violence was now emerging as something calculated, something desperate, something meticulously staged to protect a man who had spent years building an image he would do anything to preserve. For 6 years, Peter Daniels had lived under the protective veil of community sympathy, untouchable, admired, and trusted. But the quiet, unassuming discovery of Angela's diary, paired with Naomi's brave decision to step forward and the hard facts of a crumbling financial empire, shattered that protection. The case was no longer stalled. The investigation had new life, new urgency, and a new direction. And at the center of it all was a man whose carefully crafted world was finally beginning to collapse under the weight of the truth. 6 years after the night that shattered the Daniels home, investigators finally had the pieces they needed to reconstruct the truth. Angela's diary, Naomi's report, and the financial records laid out a timeline that was clearer and darker than anyone had first believed. What looked like a random act of violence was nothing random at all. Peter Daniels, once the respected pastor and admired businessman, was a man quietly collapsing behind his public image. For years, he had watched the foundation of his carefully built life start to crack. Church donations were falling. Loans were piling up. Business ventures that had once seemed promising were now sinking under debt. On paper, Peter Daniels still looked successful, but inside his accounts and behind his polished smile, desperation was building. Angela, quietly trapped in a life of isolation and control, had made up her mind. She wanted out. Her diary showed her growing fear, her exhaustion, her last attempt to find a way to protect herself and her baby. To Peter, Angela's decision to leave was not just a family matter. It was the ultimate betrayal. It threatened everything he had worked to construct: his reputation, his standing, his crafted image, as the man who had it all together. As detectives walked through the timeline, it became clear that Peter's plan had been carefully shaped. The night before the murder, he turned off the house alarm himself. He made sure valuables were left untouched. He poisoned the family dog to ensure there would be no noise, no alert, no barrier when he carried out what he had already decided had to happen. Peter Daniels staged the break-in, murdered Angela and their baby, and crafted the scene to look like they had been victims of an intruder. The man who had once stood in the pulpit, preaching about loyalty and faith, was revealed to be a man hiding deep insecurity and rising panic. His public charm was a mask, carefully maintained while his private world spun further out of control. The day investigators sat Peter down for questioning after reopening the case, they watched his facade crack piece by piece. He began calmly, speaking in the smooth tones they had heard so many times before. But as the evidence was laid out, Angela's diary, Naomi's report, the financial collapse, the forensic matches, Peter's voice grew quieter, his hands trembled, his shoulders sank. He admitted knowing Angela was planning to leave. He admitted disabling the alarm. He admitted staging the break-in. And then, in a voice so low the detectives had to lean in to hear, He said the words that would end any doubt. I couldn't let it all fall apart. Those words hung in the air, carrying the weight of years of deception, control, and fear. Peter Daniels had not acted in a moment of rage. He had acted out of a calculated, desperate need to maintain the life he had built, no matter the cost. The emotional weight of the truth hit hard. Angela's silent suffering, written only in private pages, had been hidden under a layer of public admiration for years. The baby, a symbol of new life and new beginnings, had been caught in the path of a man's collapsing ego. Peter's community, his congregation, his friends, all had been fooled, not because they were blind, but because Peter had mastered the art of presenting only what he wanted them to see. For 6 years, the truth had waited, buried under charm and reputation, but now it stood exposed. The story of Peter Daniels was no longer one of loss and grief. It was a story of betrayal, control, and the terrible price of protecting an image at all costs. And as the confession settled into the record, there was no turning back. The man once seen as untouchable had been brought down, not by outside enemies, but by the truth he had spent years trying to keep hidden. The trial of Peter Daniels began under the harsh glare of media attention, drawing eyes not only from the quiet streets of Silver Creek, Georgia, but from far beyond the town's borders. Reporters lined the courthouse steps, cameras captured every arrival, and the once unshakable image of the respected pastor was now overshadowed by headlines describing a man accused of orchestrating the deaths of his own wife, his baby, and even the family dog, all to protect a crumbling reputation. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Angela's family sat together, faces drawn, eyes filled with quiet grief, their hands clasped tightly as they prepared to hear the painful details laid out for the world to see. Naomi, seated further back, watched silently, her heart heavy, knowing that her decision to come forward had helped bring this moment to pass. Witness after witness took the stand. Friends who had once admired Peter described the charming, confident man they had followed for years. Church members spoke of his powerful sermons, his passionate prayers, his apparent devotion to his family. But then came the voices that peeled back that polished image. Detectives detailed the hidden financial collapse, the staged crime scene, the alarm system deliberately turned off, the poison dog. Forensic experts explained how the evidence matched no outside intruder, but pointed inward to someone inside the home. And then came Angela's diary, her words read aloud in a courtroom filled with people who had never known the private fears she had carried. Each page painted a picture of a woman, isolated, controlled, body-shamed, and quietly planning to break free, only to have her plans cut short in the most brutal way. Peter's defense team tried to present him as a man under pressure, a man who had suffered deep loss, a man who had been broken by grief. But the prosecution's case was relentless. They showed Peter not as a broken man, but as a man desperate to maintain control. A man who saw his wife's independence as a threat. A man who calculated every move to protect his standing, no matter who he had to silence to do it. The courtroom held its breath as the verdict was read. Peter Daniels, once the beloved pastor, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There were no outbursts, no dramatic denials, no final speeches. Peter sat quietly, shoulders slumped, the weight of his downfall settling over him as the reality of the sentence became clear. Outside the courtroom, the emotional aftermath rippled through the community. Angela's family mourned not just the loss of a daughter and a granddaughter, but the years they had spent believing in the man who had taken them away. Naomi, reflecting on her own narrow escape, felt both relief and sorrow, knowing how close she had come to sharing Angela's fate. The church congregation fractured, divided between those who could not reconcile the man they had known with the crimes he had committed, and those who felt betrayed, deceived by a leader they had trusted with their faith. For Silver Creek, the trial marked the end of a long, painful chapter, but the scars it left behind would not fade easily. The truth had been exposed, the man who had fooled them all brought to justice, but the ache of betrayal, of loss, of unanswered what-ifs, would linger in every corner of the town for years to come. Long after the trial ended and the courtroom doors closed, the questions hung heavy over Silver Creek. How do we miss the truth about the people we trust most? How do we look into the face of someone we admire and fail to see the cracks beneath the surface? Could anyone have intervened to save Angela and her baby? Were there warning signs that were ignored? Moments when a quiet word or a simple act might have changed the course of everything. What does this case say about the power of reputation? About the way a public image can blind us to the pain happening just behind closed doors? How often do we place people on pedestals, trusting the stories they tell us, without ever asking what they're hiding in the shadows? Peter Daniels was a man who fooled everyone, not just because he was clever, but because people wanted to believe in him. They wanted to believe in the story of a man who had it all together, who preached about faith and family, who smiled on Sundays and shook hands with grace. But behind that image was a desperate need for control, an obsession with appearances, a willingness to sacrifice even the people closest to him to maintain the life he had built. Angela's voice, silenced for so long, now speaks through the pages she left behind. Naomi's courage, coming forward despite the risk, helped break open a truth that had been buried under years of lies. Story 5. She thought it was a new beginning, a second chance at something most people only get once. Love, companionship, a reason to cook for two again, to laugh at the end of the day, to be seen, not just remembered. She had prayed for this, waited for this, and when he came, charming, soft-spoken, full of scripture, she believed he was the answer. So she opened the door, handed over her trust, her savings, her house key, and her heart. October 27th, 2023. 3 days after saying, "I do," something happened. No break-in, no sign of struggle, no goodbye. Just a scarf pulled tight around her neck. Rochelle Marie Johnson was born on March 14th, 1961, in the heart of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The kind of place where neighbors still wave from their porches and gospel music floats out of cracked windows on Sunday mornings. She was the eldest of 4 children, 2 brothers, 1 sister, and from a young age, she became second in command to her mother. She learned early what it meant to care for others, packing school lunches, heating bottles, wiping tears, helping with homework. Her hands were always full, but she never complained. Her father was a mechanic, soft-spoken, wore the same 3 work shirts for years. Her mother, a part-time seamstress with the voice of a choir soloist and the work ethic of someone twice her size. They raised Rochelle to believe in hard work, decency, and most of all, faith. Church was every Wednesday and Sunday, no excuses. Rochelle sang in the youth choir, joined the usher board, memorized scripture like it was poetry. By the time she turned 24, she had already finished her LPN training and was working double shifts at Our Lady of the Lake Hospital. That same year, she married James Carter Sr., a long-haul trucker with broad shoulders, a deep voice, and a reputation for loyalty. They weren't flashy. They didn't take fancy vacations. They didn't even have cable for most of their marriage. But they were solid. He called her Shell. She called him Big Man. Together, they raised a son, bought a modest 3-bedroom home off Winburn Avenue. Rochelle kept a strict budget, coupon envelopes, handwritten grocery lists, coin jars labeled for vacation, tithe, and emergencies. She didn't trust banks much, but she trusted God. Over 31 years, they built a quiet life rooted in routine. Monday laundry, Thursday Bible study, Friday seafood dinners, and every other Sunday spent visiting family. They had their arguments like anyone else, but there was never a doubt. James was hers and she was his. Then came 2018. The diagnosis was quick. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The man who had spent decades behind the wheel of 18-wheelers suddenly couldn't hold down soup. Rochelle did what she had always done. She took care of him, bathed him, read to him, held his hand through chemo, and when the time came, she signed every paper, handled every arrangement, and made sure he was buried in the blue suit he wore to their wedding. After that, the house felt too big. She stopped cooking full meals. The guest room stayed closed. Her son, James Jr., had already left for Atlanta years earlier and didn't call much. They weren't estranged exactly, but there was a distance neither one of them reached across. She filled the quiet with devotionals and gospel CDs. Spent her evenings on the recliner scrolling through Facebook groups like Widows of Faith and Encouragement for the Brokenhearted. Her profile picture stayed the same for 5 years. Her and James standing in front of Mount Zion Church, arms locked, smiles bright under the Louisiana sun. But behind the keyboard, Rochelle was lonely. The kind of loneliness that doesn't come with loud cries or breakdowns, just silence. An empty chair at the table, a coat still hanging on the hook. Her neighbors noticed she didn't host fish fries anymore, didn't put up Christmas lights. The porch swing started to rust. The garden overgrew. She kept her pain private. When cousin Linda would call, once a week every Thursday, Rochelle always said the same thing. I'm okay, just staying out the way. It was just past midnight on October 19th, 2022, when Rochelle signed up for Christian Hearts United, a modest online forum for widows and single believers looking to find companionship. The site wasn't flashy, just profile pictures, a few scripture quotes, and a message board. But it felt safe, familiar, quiet. She filled out her profile slowly. Name, Rochelle. Age, 61. Faith, Baptist. Favorite verse, Proverbs 3.5. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. She uploaded a picture of herself in her Sunday dress, sky blue with a matching hat, a warm smile, no makeup, a small silver cross resting on her collarbone. 3 hours later, a message came in. Your smile reminds me of peace. I'd love to talk, sister. God led me to your page. His name was Marcus Lamont Ellison, 38, from Houston, Texas. His profile said, Christ follower, author, future husband. His favorite verse, Jeremiah 29:11. His picture showed a man in a crisp button-down leaning on a balcony with the Houston skyline behind him. Clean haircut, a small Bible tucked under his arm. Rochelle hesitated, then replied, Thank you for your kind words. May God bless you. What started as a polite exchange became daily communication, then hours-long conversations, then video calls. At first, it was scripture. He'd quote from Psalms. She'd respond with something from Isaiah. They prayed together, shared devotionals. Then came the stories. Marcus spoke about growing up without a father. Said his mother died of an overdose when he was 16. Talked about years spent on the streets. Said he was lost in the world until God found him in a halfway house in San Antonio. He said he'd been clean for 6 years. That the streets were behind him now. That he'd written 2 self-published Christian books. Rochelle listened, asked questions. She never judged. He said most people didn't ask him about his pain. They just saw his smile and assumed it had always been there. He told her, You're different. You see me. By November, they were talking twice a day. Rochelle hadn't smiled that much in years. Her cousin Linda noticed the shift in her voice. Said she was humming again while cooking. Even posted a selfie for the first time since James passed. A filtered photo of her in a red blouse. The caption, God makes all things new. When Linda asked who took the picture, Rochelle just laughed. A friend, she said. December came, then Christmas. Marcus mailed her a gift. A necklace with the word faith engraved on it. No return address, just a note inside the box. Next year, we spend this together. Rochelle showed it off at church like a teenager. Her friends asked questions. She said they'd met through ministry. She didn't share too much, but inside she was already rearranging parts of her life. Marcus started bringing up the future. You're the woman I prayed for, he told her. I want a Proverbs 31 wife and you're her. You are God's answer to everything I thought I lost. January brought more changes. Marcus said he was working on relocating to Baton Rouge, that he had job prospects, but needed to clear his record, fix his credit, pay off some legal fees from his past. He said these things with shame in his voice, but always followed with, God is still working on me. Rochelle didn't flinch. In early February, she sent him $5,000. Just to help get your license reinstated, she said. A week later, it was $12,000. To pay off a warrant, he said was holding him back from signing a lease. He never asked with pressure, never demanded. It always came after a prayer, a testimony, or a moment where he made her feel like she was saving him. He used words that made her feel chosen. You're the blessing I thought I'd never get. I want to spend the rest of my life honoring you. She didn't tell anyone about the money, not even Linda. She told herself it wasn't about the amount. It was about helping him step into the man God meant him to be. They started talking about marriage. By the end of March, she had wired a total of $37,000 to Marcus. More would come later, but it wasn't the money that bound her to him. It was the idea that, after all she had lost, she was finally being seen again. He called her my wife before she ever said yes, told her to start planning colors for the living room, said he couldn't wait to fall asleep beside her each night. And when he called her on Valentine's Day with tears in his voice, saying he didn't think he was worthy of her love, Rochelle cried too, because she believed him. She believed everything. And by the time April came, she had already started moving her savings into one account. For them, for their life, for what she thought was love. But love doesn't come with invoices. And the truth was, Rochelle wasn't building a future. She was being prepared for something else entirely. And the man she trusted most was already planning what would happen next. By late spring, the conversations changed. The long, late-night calls that used to be about scripture and shared dreams began to shift toward logistics, plans, numbers, deadlines. Marcus told Rochelle he was ready to come to Baton Rouge for good. But there was a catch. He said he had found a small home just a few blocks from her church, a place they could renovate together. Something we can build on, he said. Fresh start. God's foundation. But the problem, he explained, was his credit. Bad decisions from his past were haunting him. Payday loans, medical bills, a repossessed vehicle. He told her the bank wouldn't approve the mortgage without help. If we want this house, Rochelle, I need to clean this up first. Then she called her pension board, asked about early withdrawals, filled out the paperwork, didn't tell her son, didn't mention it to Linda. When asked later why she kept it private, she said, "It was our business. No one else's." By mid-June, she had wired over $160,000 to Marcus. Then came the contractors. Rochelle hired a team to redo her flooring. Hardwood in the living room, tile in the kitchen, a new walk-in shower in the master bath, fresh paint, accent walls. When her neighbor asked about the changes, she smiled. "We're starting our life here." Marcus didn't show up for the renovations, but he sent ideas, inspiration photos, video messages talking about where he wanted to hang the wedding photos, where the flat screen would go, which curtains to order. By August, she had spent $765,000, her entire life savings, every cent she and James had built, all for this new life. She even bought a new mattress. That's when Linda noticed something was off. It started with the missed Bible study, then the canceled lunch dates, then the shift in Rochelle's appearance. Her clothes changed, brighter colors, tighter fit. She got her hair dyed, started wearing heels again, bought makeup from a boutique she used to say was too much money for powder. And when Linda asked about Marcus directly, Rochelle just smiled and said, "God told me he's my blessing." The words didn't come from a place of confidence. They came rehearsed, like something she had to keep telling herself to believe it. Linda pressed, "Have you even met this man in person yet?" Rochelle answered softly, "No, but I will. Soon. He's moving here before fall." The concern in Linda's voice turned to alarm. She'd seen this pattern before, in other women, in her own daughter's friend who got scammed by a man claiming to be a deployed soldier. She asked Rochelle point blank, "What if he's using you?" Rochelle looked away and whispered, "I prayed on it." Linda didn't let up, called her twice in 1 week, showed up at her house unannounced, asked about bank statements, about this joint account. Rochelle wouldn't let her see anything. "You think I'm stupid?" She snapped once. "I'm not stupid, Linda. I know what I'm doing." But she didn't sound sure. The final time they spoke before the wedding, Linda slowed down, told her she'd never forgive herself if something happened. Rochelle just smiled again. That same weekend, she bought a wedding dress off an online boutique. Ivory, long sleeves, a simple train. She never even got to wear it in public. October 24th, 2023. It was a Tuesday. Cloudy skies over Baton Rouge. Mild breeze. Humid like usual. Except to Rochelle. By 8 a.m. she was up and dressed. Not in a gown. Not in pearls. But in a pale pink skirt suit and modest heels she'd picked out the night before. Her small black purse held a fresh marriage license, a Bible, and a velvet ring box. No bouquet. No photographer. No family. Just her, a prayer, and a man she had never actually seen in person until that day. Marcus met her outside the courthouse on North Boulevard. He didn't bring flowers, didn't wear a boutonniere, just a fitted navy jacket, a gold chain tucked under his shirt, and a folded piece of paper with vows he claimed to have written the night before. They signed the paperwork in a room the size of a closet. The clerk barely looked up. The witness, some friend of Marcus Rochelle had never met, stood behind him, chewing gum, scrolling his phone. There were no photos, no music, no slow walk down any aisle. Just initials, signatures, and a legal stamp that said Rochelle Carter was no longer a widow. She was now Mrs. Rochelle Ellison. She texted Linda later that afternoon. "We did it." He was nervous. He's shy. "It was just us today." Linda didn't respond right away. She stared at the message, read it again. Something didn't sit right, but she didn't push it. She figured they'd have dinner or a small gathering later, but no invitation ever came. Marcus didn't post anything online. His social media stayed quiet. Rochelle updated her Facebook cover photo to a blurred image of roses, but nothing else. No photos of rings, no just married hashtags. By that evening, Marcus had moved into Rochelle's house. The neighbors saw a black sedan parked in the driveway with out-of-state plates. A man stepped out carrying 2 duffel bags. They saw Rochelle come out to greet him. She hugged him like she'd known him her whole life. One neighbor, Ms. Geraldine, from 2 doors down, watched from her porch. She'd only ever seen Rochelle come and go alone. She said later, the way she clung to him, it was like she was holding on to something she didn't want to lose. For years, music poured through the windows. Not gospel, not old-school R&B, something younger. Bass-heavy, loud enough to rattle the blinds. A neighbor knocked once to complain. No one answered. By 11 p.m. it went quiet. No more music, no TV, just stillness. Nobody saw Rochelle again after that. No morning walks, no trash taken out, no porch light. Rochelle was left in slippers and again leaving in Rochelle's car. He waved at no one, spoke to no one, kept his eyes down and moved quickly. Over the next 2 days, Rochelle missed 2 church calls, didn't show up for Wednesday Bible study, and never returned Linda's voicemails. The house, once full of light, stayed dark. Whatever had happened behind those closed doors had already happened. And the woman who had just given her whole life to a new beginning Sunday, October 27th, 2023. At Mount Zion Baptist, the choir was halfway through their second song when Sister Holloway leaned over and whispered, "Rochelle's seat is empty." It wasn't just any seat. It was the same pew she'd sat in for over 20 years, 3rd row from the front, left side, 2nd seat in. Her Bible was usually resting on the cushion before the sermon even began. But that morning it stayed empty. By the end of service, Linda was pacing the church foyer. She called Rochelle's phone once, twice. It rang, then voicemail. No reply. She tried again Monday morning. Nothing. Straight to voicemail. By noon, she was already behind the wheel of her car, headed toward Rochelle's house. Linda said later that she wasn't just checking in. She felt something was wrong. Rochelle standing by her front door, crying, but not saying a word. When she arrived at the house around 1:15 p.m., the curtains were still drawn. The trash bin hadn't been rolled to the curb. She knocked. No answer. She walked around the house and noticed the car was gone. Rochelle's Camry, light gold, dent on the right bumper, was always in the driveway. Linda called again, voicemail. She told them she hadn't heard from her cousin in 3 days, and it wasn't like her to disappear. Rochelle didn't travel. She didn't vanish. At 2:02 p.m., Baton Rouge PD arrived for a welfare check. The officer walked the perimeter first. No signs of forced entry. Nothing broken. Everything quiet. They knocked, waited, knocked again. Still nothing. Then, using the spare key Linda provided, they stepped inside. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was enough. Enough to know something had been still for too long. The living room was untouched, kitchen spotless. Everything appeared in place except the silence. They moved down the hallway. The bedroom door was slightly ajar. Inside, they found Rochelle, face up, body on top of the sheets, her arms at her sides, a silk scarf, burgundy, the same color she wore to church last Easter, was wrapped tight around her neck. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken lamps, no bruises on her hands, nothing on the walls, just her, lifeless. The room was eerily neat, her glasses on the dresser, her wedding Bible still open to Ecclesiastes. The ring Marcus had given her was gone. Her purse was missing. The drawer to her nightstand was open. Martha stood in the hallway, shaking. She kept whispering, no. She was just getting started again. Paramedics confirmed what was already obvious. Time of death, approximately 48 to 72 hours prior. Marcus was nowhere to be found. Her car? Gone. Her phone? Disconnected. Police began taking inventory. Drawers in the bedroom were ransacked. Jewelry box emptied. Envelope of cash from the second drawer, gone. It didn't feel random. Felt finished. Investigators pulled her recent bank activity. The final transaction raised alarms. An ATM withdrawal made in Lafayette, over an hour away using Rochelle's debit card. Date: the morning of October 25th. A second transaction came minutes later. A motel room booked under her name. The front desk clerk confirmed a man had checked in alone. They printed surveillance. The timestamp matched. The man was Marcus. He was wearing Rochelle's gold cross, carrying her suitcase and smiling. Within 72 hours of saying, "I do," Rochelle's life had ended, and the man who vowed to protect her was already running. By the time Rochelle's autopsy report was finalized, detectives were already chasing shadows. No known employer, just a trail of unanswered questions. And soon, they discovered this wasn't the first time he'd disappeared. When his name was run through national databases, a chilling pattern began to form. The first was Charlene Mitchell in Columbia, South Carolina, a 59-year-old retired school administrator who met Marcus on a faith-based dating site in 2019. Same approach. Scripture, sympathy, soft words. He told her he wanted to start a men's ministry and needed help with a down payment for a commercial space. She wired him $55,000 over 4 months. The day she asked him to meet her pastor, he vanished. Changed numbers. Deleted his profile. Police couldn't trace the funds. Charlene never got her money back. Then came Gina Tolliver in Jackson, Mississippi. This time it went further. She reported an assault in 2021. Said she didn't know, and she invited Marcus over after 6 months of online dating. What started as a dinner turned into a night of fear. She claimed he forced himself on her, then took her car for 2 days. She filed charges, but with no witnesses, no physical injuries documented, and no money trail, he walked. She never spoke publicly again. The third was Deborah Cates, 67, from Little Rock, Arkansas, a quiet woman with a modest pension and no children. She gave $8,000 to a man she believed was her fiancé. Her last bank activity showed a withdrawal of $8,000 from a gas station ATM 2 counties over. Deborah hasn't been seen since. No body, no arrest, just her face on a missing persons flyer, slowly curling at the edges, taped to a supermarket bulletin board. Each case came with the same footprint: lonely women, online faith forums, sudden disappearances. But no one had ever caught him in time. Until now. On the morning of October 30th, 2023, Lafayette police received a tip from a motel clerk. A man had checked in using a woman's ID, but the photo didn't match. Said his name was Marcus Wren. Paid in cash. But something about him seemed off. He never left his room. Kept the curtains shut tight. Always asked for extra towels. Officers knocked once. Didn't answer. Knocked again. Heard shuffling. When they entered, Marcus was sitting on the edge of the bed, shirtless, holding Rochelle's wedding Bible. Beside him, her suitcase, laptop, credit cards, and engagement ring. In the drawer, they found 3 wigs, 2 burner phones, and a folded notepad. They arrested him without incident. He never asked for a lawyer, never asked for a phone call, just stared at the wall like he had finally stopped pretending. For the first time in years, his run was over. But the damage he left behind, names, memories, broken women, empty accounts, was just beginning to surface. And as detectives read through the messages, the voice notes, Rochelle Carter wasn't the exception. She was just the one who finally made the system listen. It had been 9 months since Rochelle Carter was found dead in her own bed. 9 months of hearings, interviews, expert analysis, and public outcry. But now, the man accused of preying on her trust, Marcus Lamont Ellison, was finally in front of a judge and jury. The courtroom was packed. Local news trucks lined the street outside. They sat shoulder to shoulder. Some just came to see justice. Others came because they were survivors too. Of scams, of assault, of silence. Marcus entered in shackles in a muted gray suit. He had trimmed his beard, kept his eyes forward, showed no emotion as the charges were read aloud. First-degree murder, theft, fraud, identity abuse. The prosecution came prepared. The evidence, phone logs showing weeks of daily contact with Rochelle leading up to her death. Bank statements detailing over $750,000 moved into a joint account Marcus controlled. Surveillance footage from the Lafayette Motel clearly placing him with Rochelle's belongings 2 days after her death. But it was the messages that silenced the courtroom. One from September 15th. If she gives me the rest, I'm good. Once I get that bag, I'm gone. Another from just days before the wedding. She's too deep in now. All I gotta do is play it right. Marcus's defense attorney leaned hard into doubt. He claimed Rochelle's death was a tragic accident. That the silk scarf was used during an intimate moment between a newlywed couple. That Marcus panicked when he found her unresponsive, didn't know what to do, and fled out of fear, not guilt. But then came the photos, pulled from Rochelle's phone and backed up to her cloud account. One, dated 2 nights before her death, showed a faint bruise on her left bicep. Another showed her wrist, red and tender. She hadn't sent them to anyone, hadn't posted them. She had saved them quietly under an album title just in case. Then came the forensics. A coroner testified to ligature marks around the neck. Tight, consistent with controlled pressure. Not spontaneous, not mistaken, not accidental. And under Rochelle's fingernails, traces of Marcus's DNA. Skin cells, dried blood, consistent with a struggle. When prosecutors presented that evidence, Marcus finally reacted. He lowered his head, rubbed his palms together, blinked fast and hard, like a man trying to hold back something. Tears, regret, or the realization that the game was over. The jury deliberated for just under 6 hours. When they returned, they spoke as one. Guilty. First-degree murder. Life without parole. There was no celebration in the courtroom. No applause. Just quiet. Some cried. Some held hands. And Linda, seated in the second row, stared straight at Marcus as the verdict was read. She didn't blink. Later, she said he didn't just take her life, he made her think it was love. In court, that was the hardest part. Because Rochelle didn't die in fear. She died in trust. And that's what made the loss impossible to measure. In the months following the trial, Rochelle's name stopped being just part of a headline. She became a face, a story, a lesson. And for some, she became a call to action. Her cousin Linda didn't stop at grief. She stepped into something bigger. In early 2025, Linda was invited to testify before the U.S. Senate Committee on Aging. Her voice trembling but steady, she stood before lawmakers and read from Rochelle's journal. I prayed for a second chance. I believe God hears me. I just hope this man is real. Linda looked up from the paper. She didn't lose her life to violence in an alley or to illness in a hospital bed. She lost it to manipulation, to trust, to silence. The country needs to do more for women like Rochelle. Her testimony sparked new attention. Within 6 weeks, A bipartisan bill was introduced aimed at improving digital safety measures for seniors, including mandatory fraud warnings on dating platforms targeting vulnerable age groups. Back home in Baton Rouge, Rochelle's church did what they knew best. They honored her with something living, a memorial garden, roses, marigolds, a wooden bench with a plaque that read Rochelle Marie Carter, faithful in love, forever remembered. Every spring, her church family gathers there. They pray, they sing, they remind each other that evil doesn't get the last word. And then there was her son. He'd kept his distance for years. Some say it was pride. Others say it was pain. They hadn't spoken in person, but when news of Rochelle's murder hit the national press, he flew back to Baton Rouge without delay. At a press conference following the sentencing, standing beside Linda and the district attorney, he read a brief statement. "My mama deserved better. She gave love and got betrayal. I ignored her calls too many times. I didn't show up when she needed me. But I know this now. She wasn't weak. She was strong. She was just tired of being alone." He didn't take questions. He posted about it on social media. But the next day, he visited the garden, sat on the bench for nearly an hour, said nothing, just sat. And for those who knew Rochelle really knew her, it was enough, because even in her absence, she was still bringing people together. As the rain falls and the night deepens, thank you for being here with me at Radio Night Crime. True crime stories remind us of life's mysteries and the need to stay aware, even in the stillness of the night. If you enjoyed tonight's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let the sound of the rain lull you to sleep, and until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and let the night keep you company.